All right, hello. I am Robby Soave. I'm a staff editor at Reason Magazine, contributor to the Detroit News, and a former reporter for the Daily Caller. I cover campus issues and education more broadly, but higher education is my first love. And I am joined by.
Angus Johnston. I teach history at the City University of New York at Hostos Community College. I operate the website studentactivism.net. I'm a historian of student activism and American higher education. I'm getting used to the fact that everything is flipped around from what I'm expecting visually. And I am student activism at student activism on Twitter. I'm a historian of American student activism and American social movements.
Okay, and we would like to discuss a subject today, I think near and dear to both of our hearts, the climate on campus relating to speech and expression and ideology. I know from my perspective, I'm concerned when I cover campus issues, news items. To me, it looks like I see a lot of hostility toward the idea of free expression, the idea that you should always be open to hearing uh, new arguments, that you should defend to the death the other person's right to say something you disagree with, the sort of like enlightenment liberal sense that is so important at campuses. And I see this happen a lot with speakers brought to campus. Just last week, I think I was covering the Christina Hoff Summers at Georgetown and Oberlin, where the students and to be fair, of course, they should they can protest, they can disagree with what she's saying, but a lot of times it seems like it's crossing a line into I don't even want to hear what they're saying. And sometimes that crosses into very like abject censorship when when students are clamoring for universities to not invite certain speakers, Bill Maher, Condoleezza
Right.
Rice, all those things. And I have lots of thoughts about what's causing that, the students themselves, the administrators. I think even like government actors are playing a role. But I guess I would love to get your feedback on do you also think this is a problem? Is it less of a problem? And so what do you see?
Well, I think there are a few different pieces to what you just described, and I think it's really important to disaggregate them. I think they're often conflated and combined in ways that is not particularly helpful. So the first thing is that I would say is that nobody has an obligation to listen to anybody. Nobody has an obligation to be in dialogue with anybody. I've written some stuff that was extremely critical of stuff that Christina Hoff Sommers has written. And I would love it if she would respond and address the fact that I think that she is actually falsifying some of her claims. She hasn't. She chooses not to, and that's her decision. And it is entirely her right not to engage with me. It's entirely her right not to participate in dialogue, just as it's my right to not participate in dialogue with my critics. There's some folks who address and complain about things that I've written, who I'm happy to talk to, and there's others who I find it unhelpful ultimately to engage with, and I'm not particularly interested in hearing what they have to say. So I think that when we say that folks aren't interested in listening to the other side, I think that we're treading on kind of thin ice. And I think one of the things one of the phrasings that you used was that people aren't interested in listening to new perspectives and new ideas. One of the things that I think a lot of folks on the left would say is that these are not new ideas. These are ideas that have been around for a long time. They're ideas that are dominant in society. They're ideas that people have heard before. And because I don't necessarily want to listen to them again doesn't mean that I haven't engaged with them in some way on my own speed and on my own terms.
But don't you think that's certainly true for you, but don't you think the students, I mean, I would disagree that a lot of them are so familiar with a perspective that Summers is offering that they've already heard it, evaluated it, decided it doesn't apply, rejected it. So it's kind of wasting their time to engage with it again. And I agree anyway that they have, the right to not engage with it. But I think, I mean, it is a college. I want students to like, become better informed, even about perspectives they're going to, like utterly end up rejecting. I think it still makes their own views stronger to have heard them and to kind of, wrestled with why they don't accept them. And I think that's like a helpful exercise that I worry is being let go of a bit.
Well, I think it's a helpful exercise, but I think it's an exercise that, by its very nature, needs to be voluntary. It needs to be a decision that a person makes. And it's not clear to me that people are engaging less with people that they disagree with today on the American campus than they did 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. That claim is one that I'm not sure that anybody is presenting evidence for, and it's one that I'm not certain I can co-sign.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to sort of there's no like objective measurement there, and certainly some of these issues have been going on for like a long time. And I appreciate that the perspective that speech saying I don't like this speech or I don't want to hear this speech is also speech. I accept that, but I mean, I still have the feeling that it's a class. They're students in a classroom, in a broad sort of experiment of educating themselves, and I just think they should be subjected to so much different information. And you see a lot of prominent, often kind of a certain leftist self-describing that way, where like their minds are made up and they are, they they're sensitized. They don't want to. It will trouble them to hear something. It's so offensive to them. Ideas that maybe are wrong, but they should at least be listening to.
Well, a couple of things. One is I don't get a lot of conservative students coming to my events when I speak on campuses, and I don't think I've ever complained about that. I think that there is something that is going on in our society right now where ideas which have a lot of support in the dominant culture, the folks who adhere to those ideas get upset or angry when folks dismiss them, and as if there is some sort of an obligation of people to at least ritually bow in the direction of engaging with ideas that are very, very popular in the broad culture, which they reject. I think that is, if you will excuse the expression, a reflection of privilege. The idea that you are used to being listened to, and that it perturbs you when people are not listening to you. A lot of the folks that we're talking about, a lot of the activists and the students and the leftists, are used to not being listened to, and they are fighting to be heard at all.
That's true. They're fighting to be heard, in a way though that I mean, like when they put pressure on universities, successfully put pressure on universities, for instance, to rescind speaking invitations.
Okay, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's actually a more complicated one than a lot of people make out. There's a few things that I think are important to note about that. One is that the question of who speaks on campus is itself at every stage fraught with debate and discussion. It's not like anybody has a right to speak on campus. Again, I would like to be invited more places than I'm invited, but it's the decision of the institution and the decision of the inviting body whether to bring me out. And so if you have a situation where an administration, for instance, decides to bring somebody to campus, particularly in the case of something like a graduation, where this is an event that is for students. This is an event that the entire purpose of the event is to honor students and to be oriented around what what students want. And if administrators bring somebody out who the students don't want to see and don't want to hear from, it's not clear to me that it is anti-free speech for students to say, you know what, this is not the speaker that we would like to have. This is not somebody that we are interested in having share what is essentially our day. I think it's also important that this speaker stuff is often about how the university organizes its resources, that these speakers are in many cases being paid very large fees, which in many cases are coming out of student money. So the idea that students should have a voice in deciding who speaks at graduation is not one that that seems all that bizarre or anti-enlightenment to me.
Well, I'm not convinced that it's a violation of free speech law. For instance, I'm not saying that, but I do. I mean, to try to find someone that is, you know, that you would object, that no student would object to, I mean, is like impossible. So then, doesn't it sort of get into, are we going to satisfy these students, or are we going to satisfy these students? And I mean, there's almost a sort of privilege built into that, where like the loud, very offended, well-connected students on campus are going to be, heard in that respect.
Well, but the other piece of that, the flip side of that coin, is that more often than not, these attempts to get speaker invitations rescinded fail. And the ones that get a huge amount of attention are the ones that are led by liberal or left students, because that is a story that we like to tell. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, recently compiled a list of all of these instances in which speakers were disinvited or folks attempted to disinvite speakers. And literally the second person on the list chronologically was Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers was invited to a campus to give a commencement address, and a bunch of students said, you know what, we really don't want the guy who ran a kiddie TV show to be addressing us at this moment in our lives. So they protested, and they wrote they wrote up a petition, and then ultimately the administration didn't back down and went through with the invitation. And Mr. Rogers gave what I understand to have been a great speech. I personally am a huge fan of Mr. Rogers and would love to see him speak. But that is not a story that folks give a lot of attention to, and that is a story which is, I think, seen as somehow less inimical to freedom of speech than some of these others, which suggests that the complaints about suppression of speech, so-called suppression of speech, are themselves ideological.
Well, you do have a lot of, certainly, maybe at most campuses, a lot of the time things are fine. You don't hear when everything's fine, but, we can point to case after case of this sort of like, a brand of progressive liberal hysteria over a speaker, or over at my native campus of the University of Michigan, like 2 weeks ago, the Muslim Student Association wouldn't let them screen American Sniper.
Well, wouldn't let them scream? How did they prevent it?
They protested it. They demanded that the university not show it, and the university complied.
Okay, so the university chose not to.
Right. And not a illegal speech violation, but
right. But what I'm saying is, it's very important to use language that reflects the actual power relations that are going on these campuses. Right. When you say that the Muslim Students Union wouldn't let them screen this film, what you're saying is that the Muslim Students Union had the power to prevent it and exercise that power to prevent this speech act, when that's actually not what happened, right?
Well, but you were talking about privilege. Like, they're the students with all the power and all the authority. Everyone on campus is.
I think if you would ask Muslim students on most campuses whether they feel that they have all the power and all the authority on campus, most of them would really powerfully disagree with you. And frankly, I would find their argument compelling. The idea that Muslim students somehow have more power and more authority and more institutional privilege on most American student campuses is, again, one that I find a little bit sketchy.
I do not find sketchy at all. Actually, I know. I think that's the case. I think, I mean, not
So you think,
specifically Muslim
so,
students.
well, let's know, but you said specifically Muslim students. So let's look at specifically Muslim students. How would we determine that in some sort of an empirical way? Are they overrepresented on the American campus?
No, no, no. I mean,
Prob-
they have an issue. The university listens to them. I mean, people making like a sort of progressive, uh, ethnic or religious minority liberal claim, they get listened to by their administration. They get, they get their demands heeded. They,
but is this an impression that you have, or do you have evidence to back it up?
I, what you
Because
see happen at like campus after campus when something offends them, everyone.
but but again, in the case of Fire, what Fire determined in terms of these speaking engagements was the vast majority, or maybe not vast, but the majority of these cases, including the majority of cases that came from students on the left, um, the student demands were rejected.
Uh, can you elaborate? What do you mean?
That when students,
The
yeah, the speaker stuff. I mean, it happens to be something that's a very clear and sort of clear cut and straightforward way of measuring, right? When students object to a speaker on campus, are their objections uh, are their objections heeded? And the reality is that in the majority of cases, when left students object to a speaker on campus, their objections are not
in
heeded.
a majority of cases, but there's still a lot of cases. It's not like a 98 to 2%.
No, but it's not that way for right wing or non-ideological cases either. There's a variety of circumstances in which it happens, and it's not a dramatic difference. And what we're describing here, what we're talking about is, I think you would describe it some sort of a veto power, right? Where they have the ability to veto, and I would say that it's not a veto; it's an objection that is sometimes heeded and sometimes not. Uh, but I think it's also important to recognize that that kind of organizing is not something that tends to win you um, positive victories. It's something that tends to be something that every once in a while you can get something stopped that you don't want to have happen, which is very, very different than running the institution. The folks who run the institutions are not, in the vast majority of cases, the sort of left wing, identity politics oriented folks that you're describing.
I think they're not activists, but they're by and large certainly like amenable to those to that perspective in a way they're just like absolutely not to conservative or libertarian students. And I definitely think, on certain campuses, on religious universities, this came up in your IQ debate, and I agree with you. Sure, you can find campuses where it's like totally the other way around. All the institutional support is for like a conservative or religious ideology, and I've seen cases of like gay students who faced enormous difficulty because they were trying to express themselves on those campuses. So I totally accept that. I'm against that too. No like ideological sort of stakes there. When we're talking about traditional public universities, the bigger campuses, this is the dichotomy that I see. I mean, another example.
Well, let me ask you a question. Would you agree that both the sort of identity politics left and the activist conservative or libertarian right are have less power on most American campuses than the broad, moderate institutional center?
And the broad,
That just the sort of mainstream liberal to moderate conservative folks who are connected to big donors, folks who are connected to the sort of typical tenured professor or high level administrator, does not tend to be either a flaming liberal or a radical conservative.
Right, I would agree with that. I mean, they are mostly. I'm pretty sure if you look at like political donations, the professoriate, the administrators, in addition to the professoriate, are
It's much more dramatic with professors, and it varies a lot by department. But yeah,
administrators are not, uh, by and large, like a majority of them, part of the activist left, where they're waking up in the morning, passionate about forcing social justice on everyone.
or even necessarily terribly sympathetic to the goals of the activist left.
Well, they're sympathetic in some sense, in that we see like steps being taken by administrators, uh, and I think we have some level of agreement on this, that administrators are taking like very affirmative steps against hostile to speech and expression, for often for non-ideological reasons, or reasons you could even classify as like a institutional conservative sort of, like a protect the university's reputation, or just
Right.
protect students from like liability. I mean, kind of absurd liability claims or something.
Right.
And like that is a huge. I don't think that student hostility toward free speech, like a progressive leftist hostility toward free speech, is the only or the paramount threat. I guess I think there is
Yeah.
some of that, but the administrators, I think some of them are coddling to that. Some of them are sort of for these other reasons I'm talking about, and also because, which I would like to get into at some point, the
Yeah.
federal government and state lawmakers, I think, are tipping that way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, before we move on, and I think it would be a good idea to move on. I think one last thing that would be useful to say here is that the students who are being arrested or beaten at the behest of university administrators on this campus for exercising free speech or other basic sort of uh, exercising their free speech rights or organizing politically on campus, the students who are being arrested or beaten on campus are overwhelmingly left wing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's fair. I mean, there's a libertarian base there too, probably trying to legalize drugs and getting beaten up too.
I I kind of pay a lot of attention to this, and I don't see. Maybe there are some examples, but I haven't seen an example in the last decade of a group that was identified as libertarian facing beating at the hands of campus police.
Well, not beating. I've seen examples of someone, for instance, trying to talk about gun rights with a politician who came to campus to speak, and he was like grabbed by the campus. Not
Okay,
not a
yeah,
not a beat. I mean, the sort of protesting is often, well. I mean, I think that's partially a symptom of the fact that the activist left are often the ones protesting, and they have a more visible profile.
absolutely, and that would also reflect the occasional successes that they have, right? If there are more of these students on campus, then and they are more well organized, I think we would both agree that liberal and left students are more effectively organizing on American campuses today.
And achieving a lot of things, many things that I agree with. I'm
Right.
happy to have them achieving. But so transitioning into the sort of uh, government and what it's doing and the administrators. So I often cover cases of sexual harassment disputes or sexual misconduct, and we're seeing so much guidance from the education department, from a certain agency in the education department, the Office for Civil Rights, that has, it's investigating all these colleges and pretty much telling them you have to, because of Title IX of the Higher Education Amendments, you have to have gender equality, and they're interpreting that to in a very broad and restrictive way, from my perspective, that is setting up a lot of conflicts between administrators and students, and administrators and professors, and students and professors, over whether you are engaging in free speech or you are saying something sexually harassing and problematic, and then also that's getting into sort of the universities being forced to adjudicate rape disputes, which is kind of a related but different topic. But I don't know your thoughts on this subject at all. So
Well, I think there's a few different pieces again of what you're describing. I think one of the things uh, that is very clear is that for a very long time on the American campus, sexual assault and sexual harassment have been um, extremely underreported and underprosecuted. That folks who were engaging in sexual harassment and sexual assault have, in many cases, been able to act with impunity on the American campus. And so, what's happening now is an attempt to address that. I think that's the starting point. I think that having said that, I think there are legitimate questions to be raised as to whether everything that's happening now is well advised. Uh, but again, I still see that the overwhelming weight of institutional power is directed around institutional self-preservation. That it is not, let me put it this way. If I were either making a complaint of sexual assault on an American campus today, or I were accused of sexual assault on the American campus today, I would not be confident of my ability to get justice. I believe that the institution's prerogatives and that the institution's desire to protect its own interests, often at the expense of students on either side of the dispute, um, lead to abuses of power and violations of rights in both directions.
yeah, I think that's important to note, and I agree that it's that both sides in sexual assault disputes are badly served by the campus process. Oftentimes, uh, I cover cases of accused students who don't get their due process rights,
Right.
but also accusers, are like often forced to like be their own prosecuting attorney at these,
Right.
and like it's just totally ridiculous that. But unfortunately, it's not so much the college's fault that they're taking on these roles because the federal government is telling them you basically have to.
Well, here's the question: what's the alternative? What's the alternative for universities adjudicating these cases?
I would just have them not adjudicate these cases and forward them all to the police.
Okay, so if you have somebody who has been accused of rape by four different students, until they are convicted of rape, they can't be kicked out of the dorms?
I think, yeah, I would say that. I mean, how would you know that you weren't just like, abridging that student who had just been uh,
Well, then you have a process. That's the point of the
well,
process,
I mean,
right?
maybe in the criminal process, you could have the police would recommend moving him out of the. You
Well, but I mean, this is the question. This is the question. In the absence of a resolution of the case by police, what do you do? Either while the case is still going on, or let's say that you have a situation where you, as an administrator, um, are 100% convinced on the basis of what you consider to be legitimate evidence that somebody is guilty of sexual assault and is living in the dorms. Um, I think that it is not quite so simple as to say, well, you just shouldn't have any process at
Well,
all.
we could separate students who were in the midst of some sort of like legal dispute, probably, and not have that be. I mean, you could do some simple common sense things there that would be like well short of a full, uh, fake criminal trial being run.
But what is the common sense thing that you would do? Let's say that you've got a situation where a student has been accused and there is no resolution to the criminal complaint. Do you want it to just be in the hands of an administrator who just makes a judgment call of their own, or do you want there to be some sort of a process that affords due process rights to the accused?
When we're talking about, I mean, when we're talking about like just separating people or maybe not having them take the same class, I think that's fine for universities to do that. But I mean, when you're talking about like full expulsion and no refund of the like tens of thousands of dollars you paid to go to this institution, then it seems crazy to me to expect that even if we did guarantee, I mean, if we were guaranteeing due process in all these hearings, it would be like a totally different matter, but that's obviously not going to happen. Or it's not clear to me that that should be the goal other than just making like the criminal justice system more available to these students or and more sensitive to
But we know that the criminal justice system is also not working, right?
I don't know
We
why
recognize
set up a system that also doesn't work and then like have two systems not working.
because the criminal justice system is overwhelmingly not working in favor of rapists, right? We agree on that, right? That the number of people who get away with rape is far higher than the number of people who are, and by orders of magnitude, right? We agree that there is the overwhelming majority of times when there is an injustice in the criminal prosecution of rape it's in favor of the rapist, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if we say that we are going to dismantle all campus policies to remove rapists from campus, what that's going to mean is that there may be a few people who were wrongly accused, but the vast majority of what that's going to mean is that there's going to be more people getting away with rape who are remaining on
removing
campus.
rapists from campus as long as they were found to be rapists by the criminal justice.
Right, but what I'm saying is the vast majority of rapists are never found guilty by the criminal justice system, right? So if we say that unless you are found guilty by the criminal justice system, you can't be removed from campus, the practical result of that, and I think we both agree on this, is that many more rapists will be allowed to remain on campus.
Yes, but
Okay. And we may say that that's worth it, right? We may say that, that because of all of the other issues that are involved and all of the other concerns that we have, that we are willing to accept that.
but I don't think kicking the rapists off campus is a good enough outcome, even to the extent that we are doing that, because they should be put in jail. Like then they can just go to some other campus, or they can
Right.
circle.
But that's an argument for a better criminal justice system, not an argument for dismantling. It's not like the reason that our criminal justice system around rape sucks is that we have a campus adjudication system, right? Eliminating the campus system won't make the criminal justice system any better.
No, and we could make the campus system better, certainly.
Right. So that's my position. My position, setting aside whether we should dismantle the campus system, we're not gonna. It's never gonna happen, right? For 100 reasons, which I don't think I need to list, we are always going to have a system on campus where campuses make an attempt to determine whether somebody has committed sexual assault and make an attempt to remove them from campus if they have. Given that, I think the clear obligation for those of us who care about this issue is to push to make, and when I say care about this issue, I mean care about both the problem of rape and also the problem of due process. The clear obligation that we have is to try and make the system better. I would argue that in the main, we are seeing improvement in the system. The system is getting better, not worse. I would say that there are a few areas in which I have concerns about where things are going, but I would say that in the vast majority of ways that you could measure this, the system is not getting worse. It's getting better.
I think it is absolutely getting worse because they're imposing definitions and laws that will result in more people being wrongfully convicted of rape.
Are they going to be? Wait, hold on a second. Are they also going to result in more people being rightly?
I don't think the. It depends what we're talking about. But if we're talking, I was going to talk about like affirmative consent and preponderance.
Wait, what's wrong with affirmative consent? Yeah. Let's dig into the specifics. What's wrong with affirmative consent?
It's explicitly gender based. It assumes a male initiator in sexual contact.
No, it doesn't. Well, some particular regulations might, but affirmative consent as a concept does not.
Affirmative consent as a concept is fine. In the way it is being implemented in places like California will absolutely trigger more confusion in these hearings.
Well, tell me why. Tell me what exactly is wrong with the California version of affirmative consent.
Because it assumes there has to be an initiator, and implicitly that initiator is going to be the male. So if he can't show that that he had consent based on a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is going to be like really, I mean, it's
Okay,
really hard to know
well, hold on a second.
cases where
Go
there's only
ahead.
two. I'm just saying when there's only two people party to this crime if
Right.
something's being alleged. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's hard.
Well, hold on one second. Okay, so the preponderance of the evidence standard is a separate question. You can have a preponderance of the evidence standard in a case of affirmative consent. You can have it in a case where you define consent differently. The preponderance of the evidence standard is not a component of the affirmative consent standard.
No, but I'm saying these two things together.
Okay, but I want to because I think this is really important because A, I think it's really important, and B, it's apparently an area where we strongly disagree, so it's a useful area for us to dig down deep. I think affirmative consent is really, really good for everybody. So if you have specific concerns with affirmative consent, specifically, let's talk about that.
Yes, I do. Well, but I mean, but like I said, I don't have an objection to the idea, like philosophically, to the idea that you don't have someone's permission to have sex with them unless they've agreed to it first. I don't have a problem with that idea, but to try to prove that you had that, and when you're, I mean, when you're attaching that to all the other things that the authorities are making you do, like the preponderance, it's going to be so hard for an accused person to, when they're accused, the onus is going to be on them to sort of prove that they had consent, and if they can't, they're going to be found guilty.
Okay, but well, hold on a second. That again is about the preponderance of the evidence standard, and what you're saying is actually that you fear that the preponderance of the evidence standard is going to be to result in actually something more than a preponderance of the evidence standard, which is going to be a sort of guilty until proven innocent standard. So I actually have qualms about the preponderance of the evidence standard. I think that there are reasons for concern about the preponderance of the evidence standard. So let's again, if what you're saying is you don't like preponderance of the evidence, then okay.
Also, we're asking non-legal expert people to like put two and two together and get four somehow, like with all.
But why is the affirmative consent standard harder to interpret than another standard would be?
I'm saying it's harder to because it would be hard. I mean, it would be harder for an administrator to correctly find a student innocent. I think I would expect to see that under an affirmative consent standard attached to all these things because the person would have to prove that they had consent, and also like that it's ongoing. Like, I mean all these kind of ridiculous videos that are ridiculous but aren't so clear to me that they're not what's required by affirmative consent, where you have to like
what do you
like now I'm touching you, now I'm kissing you, do you consent to this? Like,
but that's not but okay, but we know that that's not required. There is no affirmative consent standard in the law.
Ongoing.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be verbal.
Right.
There's
now
no.
We're asking like university administrators to determine if nonverbal cues they didn't witness were enough to constitute consent.
Well, yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Okay, but hold on a second. Let's say that we set aside the preponderance of the evidence standard, right? Let's say that we've got a stronger standard than that. Let's say that we've got a clear and compelling evidence standard or beyond the reasonable doubt standard or whatever it is. What affirmative consent says is that mere acquiescence, passive acquiescence is not evidence of consent. That's what the affirmative consent standard says. That if somebody is just lying there, not responding in any way that indicates that they are consenting to, enjoying, actively participating in what you are doing, then what you have to do in that circumstance is determine whether you have consent. And that if you don't have consent. You don't legally have consent. And what's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that. And illegally, I'm fine with that being. I'm prepared to say that should be the legal standard, or something better, even perhaps. But that what you just said is not like specifically or in total the language of the California bill, for instance.
How does it differ from the California bill?
It talks about all the other things you have to have, and also there's a confusion among that I've seen in practice among university administrators not understanding the difference between incapacitation and like actually being, or between being incapacitated and being inebriated or inhibited, but not.
Okay, but that's not about affirmative consent.
Right.
I mean, I'm sorry. I'm pushing. Oh, well.
I'm saying I have a problem with it in practice in tandem with all these other things. I think it's going to make life a lot worse for people accused of sexual assault.
Okay. All right. Okay. So affirmative. Okay. All right. Here's what I would say about that. I would agree with you that college administrators in particular are in many cases have not successfully grappled with questions of inebriation and incapacitation. I think that we have certainly got a situation in which administrators have not figured out a clear and coherent standard to implement in cases where, for instance, both parties to a sexual encounter are severely inebriated. There are instances, and I don't know how widespread it is, but there are instances in which I think that colleges are screwing that up.
And they come out gendered because
yes, absolutely.
Initiative on the part of the male when both.
Right. But again, yes, I agree with that. However, I would say, though, that is something to work on, that is something to fix, that is something to make better. But it is not clear to me that all of those kinds of issues in aggregate mean that the current system is less just than the system that we had before, which was one where, again, large numbers of rapists were able to act with impunity. In many of the cases that we're talking about, what we have is a poorly conceived investigation, which in many cases doesn't result in an expulsion. It's still very, very rare for these cases to result in expulsions. And in most of the cases where they're ending in expulsions that we know about, there are huge lawsuits being launched against the administration, in which case I suspect that we're going to see reforms to procedures. But I think there is a real danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because a lot of the reforms that are happening are very positive.
But stepping sort of maybe back in like a little bit of a big picture direction. I mean, you're a historian of activism. I presumably you have studied like sexual revolution in the '60s and things, and a lot more than I do about it. I worry that this is like a sort of very authoritarian, moralizing, sort of Victorian policing of like students' sexual lives when we're taking it to this extent and with all this pressure.
Well, let me put it this way. It is absolutely beyond arguing that we saw 100 times, 1,000 times more and more pernicious policing of students' sexual lives before the sexual revolution than today. The problems that we're dealing with now in terms of policing sexual behavior are problems of figuring out how to deal with predators in a free society. The problems that we were dealing with half a century ago were the problems of a society in which women had essentially no recourse when they were subject to sexual predation. and a society in which not only did they have no recourse in cases where they were subject to sexual predation, but also a society in which even voluntary consensual sexual activity was routinely punished in extremely draconian ways. So we are getting better at punishing rape in this society, and rape rates are, by plenty of indications, declining dramatically.
And worse off college campuses. There is more rape occurring.
Yes, yes, yes. But we are not only getting better at prosecuting rape, we are also getting better at not prosecuting consensual sexual activity. We've had an assumption here, sort of an unstated assumption, that we're talking about heterosexual sexual activity. But, if we're talking about sexual activity more broadly, all of these campuses, many of these campuses were punishing consensual homosexual activity in extremely vicious and horrific ways. And even heterosexual consensual activity was being punished regularly half a century ago. And overwhelmingly, the people who were punished in those cases were women.
And I'm in full celebration of all these things not being punished anymore. And it's like nowhere near as bad as that, and that's a great thing to celebrate. But I don't think it's like guaranteed to keep getting better. I expect things to keep getting better, but if the federal government or administrators or state legislatures are going to exercise like real pressure to kind of clamp down, like when I saw the sororities at some college were told not to go to fraternity part, it's like a very mothering or paternalistic, like guarding their sexuality from the administrative side, and that bugs me.
Oh yeah, I mean, I certainly, but again, it's the pendulum swinging back a centimeter, if at all. We're getting close to being out of time, and there was one more thing that you brought up in your email to me that I wanted to raise, and that is the question of, and this connects up with some of the stuff that you were describing before, the question of punishment of speech, and specifically the question of folks being punished for speech that students found offensive in a campus situation. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I'm seeing a couple of these cases now of you mean of the professors who are being there are professors who are investigated. Her name was Lauren Kipnis, and I can't recall off the top of my head. I think it was Northwestern or Northwestern.
Yeah.
She gave a talk about her view on feminist issue, like a very sort of sexual liberation pro speech, and some students were troubled by it, and they actually like took out Title IX complaints against her, and she's presumably being investigated. And even if she's this turns out to be ridiculous, this has to have a chilling effect to me. Things like this, and we saw it with the professor who accidentally forwarded porn to her students, like very embarrassingly, and the university's got to investigate her. Which is not to say that probably shouldn't be like dealt with so seriously, like a capital crime was committed. But I think in the aggregate, these things, or the law professors who are worried about teaching rape law with their students because they're so triggered by it, they claim there was an op-ed about that. So I worry that these things in the aggregate will hurt faculty freedom and make education less good for the students going to the campuses.
Okay, so in the case of Kipnis, I think it's important to note that one of the students that she actually talked about in this speech and has written about in other settings disputes in significant measure Kipnis's characterization of the sexual harassment complaint that she brought in the past. That Kipnis has made assertions about this one particular sexual harassment charge that was made against a professor by a student. And the student alleges that these allegations, these charges are false. And so I followed up on the link that you sent, and it didn't give details, but my suspicion is that that's what's going on in that case, that a student who alleges that she has been subject to sexual harassment, is contending that Kipnis is essentially, and I hesitate to use the legal term, but is essentially defaming her and misrepresenting her case. I think that it's also important to recognize that, I read the Harvard Law thing, and I understand the concern that faculty have, but the reality is that faculty have a huge amount more power than students. That faculty have particularly tenured faculty, have a tremendous amount of institutional power. And in a lot of these cases, what we are seeing is faculty worrying about the possibility that they may be brought up on charges, the possibility that they may be punished in some way, the possibility that their job may be threatened, in the absence of any real evidence that is a realistic fear. When reality
does happen to professors, and not always tenured, they're adjunct professors or part-time.
Okay, but when we're talking, in the case of the Harvard Law, it was a tenured professor who was expressing fear that if she taught about rape in a criminal law class at Harvard Law School, that she would be imperiling her career. There is exactly zero evidence to support that contention.
Well, I think she was also arguing, though, that it was hard to even do it because students didn't want to hear it anymore. And that would have a terrible impact on, like, training the next generation of lawyers to adjudicate rape cases.
Which suggests to me that the next generation, the current generation of law professors, need to figure out ways to address those complaints and concerns.
It suggests to me that students are too squeamish, and they're not.
Okay. Well, but I have certainly been in plenty of classrooms where professors, in an attempt to be edgy or daring or with it, made remarks and comments that were inappropriate, that were unrelated to the subject matter of the class, that were inappropriately sexualizing of the classroom environment, and which students had a legitimate reason to complain about. We generally didn't in my day. We generally didn't complain about that kind of stuff because we understood that there was no point in complaining about it. Students are complaining about that kind of stuff more. And faculty are having to think more seriously about how they teach because they are more concerned not only of having administrative punishment, but of being outed as being somebody who students find creepy. I don't have a problem with that. I think that faculty should think a little bit more about how their students are responding to what they do in the classroom, and that they should tailor what they do in the classroom to reflect a proper concern with students', let's go ahead and call it, sensitivities.
I would like them to do that as well, but if we have to tip the incentives one way or the other, I would feel much more comfortable tipping them to say more and risk offense than say too little and.
That's the way the scales are tipped now.
Valuable.
The scales are tipped now way over in the direction of faculty. As I say, faculty have hugely more power than students. We are not seeing a wave of squeamish students getting faculty members fired or even censured on the basis of benign comments that the students took the wrong way. That's just not, we're not seeing that happen. There's no evidence that there is this huge storm of that kind of complaint either being brought, much less being brought successfully.
Well, if you draw the most apocalyptic end of the world, like professors are no longer free sort of dichotomy, then yes, of course, but I do think it's happening. There are cases of it happening, and it's something to be wary of. You're not going to be very popular in the faculty room anymore. Claims that the faculty have all the power.
Well, yeah, I mean, okay, just to wrap up, I think that the core argument that I've been making throughout this is to say that if we want to understand the university and we want to understand free speech in the university, we need to understand power in the university. And we need to understand who has power and who does not. And the reality is that the folks who are being accused of being the thought police, the folks who are being accused of being the PC censors, the folks who are being accused of being, the new Victorians, all of that. In general, they have very little power. And one of the things that I would argue is that some of the excesses in rhetoric and so on that we're seeing are a reflection not of them having too much power, but them having too little. That if folks who actually gave a damn about campus sexual assault, if folks who actually gave a damn about faculty's responsibility towards students, if folks who actually gave a damn about a real diversity of opinion on campus, if those folks had more power, then I think that we would see less sniping at the heels of folks rather than more. I want to see students be more empowered because I think that the kinds of change that they will make if they have the power to make change are in general changes that I would be excited to see.
In closing, I would say that I agree that I want students to have more power and more enthusiasm for expressing what they think, and even if it's controversial, even if it's going to get them into trouble. I fear that some students and some sentiments of the things you're talking about, by no means dominating at all campuses at all the time, they are having an impact on the administrators, and these other factors I've talked about are feeding into a climate of making it harder for students in some cases to express themselves, and that's something none of us want.
Well, I think that some of us talk talk without thinking about the effects of our speech more than we should. So maybe a little bit of second thoughts is not entirely a bad thing.
Maybe.
All right, this was
I'll
wonderful.
Say what I think all the time. That's what.
All right. Well, yes, this was fun. Thanks for inviting me to do it. All right, I'm going to press the stop button.
All righty, me too. Thank you.
All right, take care.